Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tony Trahan with the Office of Mental Health, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar on trauma-informed practices. Just a brief orientation for people. Due to the volume of participants, we have to keep the lines muted, so please feel free to ask questions via the chat function on the webinar control panel. I'll be monitoring that chat function throughout the webinar, and if you have a question about a particular acronym or a concept that you don't understand, please type that in, and then we'll ask the presenter to clarify that for us. During the webinar, you may experience some momentary lapses in the audio if you're using the computer speakers. This is normal and should not interfere with the overall content of the presentation. However, if you are experiencing a lot of difficulty with that, please call into the teleconference, and the number is in the chat box right now, but I will also send it out in just a moment. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived. We'll post this on with our other recorded webinars on YouTube, and you will receive a link automatically in a follow-up email. So please feel free to share that link with other people in your agency. And we currently have, last I checked, we currently have 240 people online right now, which is one of our largest webinars ever. We had over 500 people sign up for this, and so obviously this is a huge and important topic. So I'm really glad that we're doing this, and we're also going to do another one on trauma next month that I'll give you a little more detail about at the end. So when the webinar ends, you'll get a short survey will pop up. If you could just please take the time to fill that out. If you need a certificate to verify your participation in this webinar for credentialing purposes or for your employer, please indicate this in the survey and we'll get that out to you. So for today, we have Eva Deck with us. She is a statewide trainer and community organizer for the Mental Health Empowerment Project. She is a psychiatric survivor, a human rights advocate and activist, and as an advocate for over 20 years. Eva has fought for systems transformation and becoming person-centered, recovery-focused, trauma-informed, culturally competent, and strengths-based. Eva developed and coordinated a peer-run, peer support, and advocacy group for 9 years. She worked for the Westchester County Department of Community Mental Health as a system of care advocate and wraparound training and technical assistance team. She has been the director of independent living services and the Mental Health Advocacy Project at Westchester Independent Living Center. Eva was on the director of systems advocacy at the Empowerment Center, and she served for the past 8 years on the board of directors of the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services, also known as NIAPRS. Eva is a family development credentialed trainer from Cornell University, as well as an ASSIST trainer. ASSIST stands for Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. Eva has presented at countless conferences, facilitated workshops, participated on advisory committees on county, state, and nationally. She continues to help change policy and create innovative alternative supports that promote self-determination, empowerment, and individual choice for people with disabilities and for people with psychiatric labels. And on a personal note, I remember when I first saw Eva, it was before I started working here. It was at one of our regional advisory committee meetings, and that was probably about 6.5 years ago. And I remember her just standing up and very passionately and very emphatically stating her point. And I was very impressed with what she was doing, and she has not slowed down over the past 6 years, so it's an honor to have her here today, joining us and presenting. So Eva, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. And thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar today. I'm very happy to be here. And I wanted to just give a brief overview of Mental Health Empowerment Project. For those of you who do not know, we are a statewide peer-run organization, and we provide training and support, technical assistance for a variety of peer organizations to really promote empowerment, self-help, rights-based training. And as Tony said, I'm a statewide trainer and community organizer.
So let me just interrupt for one second. I'm being told from the chat that a lot of people are telling me that the audio is low, so apparently I was not speaking loud enough, so I'm just going to ask Eva to make sure that she's also speaking up too so we can get all that information. So thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Terrific. So anyway, the Mental Health Empowerment Project is really about empowering, helping people to find their personal power and become empowered, people with psychiatric labels and diagnoses. And last year and years prior, we have really had a focus on promoting trauma-informed practices. And this past year, we had trauma-informed symposiums around the state, and we were just awarded a SAMHSA grant to continue that work. So I'm really passionate about trauma-informed practices. I am a trauma survivor, and just so that you know a little bit about my experiences, I was a child in the mental health system and was institutionalized for 5 years and witnessed a lot of injustices and horrors in many child serving systems that I was in, and really through the years have been trying to change the system, advocate for people, and to promote all the things that that we're going to be talking about today: trauma informed, strength based, and recovery focused. Can people hear me now?
No. Should be better now.
Sorry about that, guys.
No, that's my fault. Okay.
So I have personal experience in the mental health system within institutions, psychiatric, residential treatment centers, but I've also worked in psychiatric facilities and children's residential treatment centers. And I've also been a caretaker in a parental role of children with special needs that were trauma survivors. So I have a variety of personal experience, but also working in an advocacy role for about 20 years, over 20 years, really helping families and children and youth and adults that have been in the mental health and substance use, homelessness systems, and criminal justice. So that's really my experience. Can people hear now, Tony?
It's getting better.
Good? Okay.
Yeah, it's getting better.
So, so today we're going to be talking about really transforming the system to being more trauma-informed and to have more holistic approaches to trauma-informed practices. And so the overview of today, we really want to know what trauma is, how it affects people, the prevalence of trauma, looking at adverse childhood experiences, and the impact of trauma. Understanding what trauma-informed philosophy and practices are, and really understanding that it needs to be a culture shift. And we're going to talk about that. And then focusing on the different paths to wellness and healing. So, on the next slide. All right. Sorry, we're just having technical difficulties. So the first slide is what is trauma? And really understanding trauma, people often understand that it's about violence, specifically physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect. But we also need to understand that institutional abuse, that there's intergenerational trauma, disasters, and that this really causes powerlessness, fear, and hopelessness. And understanding that it puts people in a constant state of alert. It also is about abuse of power and betrayal of trust. And overall, it's an extreme stress that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. So we need to also understand that trauma affects people, and it definitely is dehumanizing, and it can be singular or many times multiple compounding events. And it's really understanding that people have a loss of safety and not having control of people's lives. And this really invokes fear, horror, and helplessness. We need to understand that it's psychological, but it's also physiological, and it has many different effects, and we're going to get into that. So other ways that trauma affects people is the impact on a person's ability to have relationships with people, but also with themselves, and relating to their communities and their environment. Also, one important point to really point out is the lack of spirituality. And I know for myself and many people that have had multiple traumatic experiences early in life, especially, that, you know, one has a very hard time believing that there is any kind of bigger connection or any kind of faith or spirituality or belief in God. If so many things, horrible things have happened to me, how could a God allow this to happen? And these result really in recurring feelings of guilt and rage, shame, and really disconnection and isolation. I think it's really important for us to understand this, because this is how it really shapes the way that we develop relationships with people. And when we're talking about providers engaging people that have a history of trauma, it's important for us to understand that this is what people are feeling in order to do outreach and to engage people. I also think that it's important, too, for us to say here that people who are providing services have vicarious trauma and secondary trauma of hearing people's stories and witnessing things over and over, and how that really shapes connecting with people. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about how it really, people who have experienced it firsthand, but also people who are providing services and how it affects them. And really understanding this to having really good services that are engaging and respectful to people. Next slide. So first and foremost, we need to, in being trauma informed, we need to understand how prevalent trauma is. And we have tons of statistics that show that the majority of people in mental health services nationwide have had a childhood experience of trauma. But there's many people who have experiences in their adult life that are traumatic. I also want to note that a person that is in the mental health system that has a diagnosis, that is traumatic in itself. Often the messages that we are still getting is that we're ill and that we're going to be ill for the rest of our lives. A lot of times the independence that we may have is often taken away, and that's traumatic. People can be working and, you know, have to go to day treatment, losing independent housing, and then many of us being locked up in a facility. So, and not just in the mental health system, but in the substance abuse system as well as homeless system. So, next slide, yeah. So I think it's important for us to also look at all the different populations that we're working with, and not to forget the military population and the amount of, especially women and men who are coming back that are very dealing with a lot of trauma, and the statistics, especially of the amount of women that are being raped. There's been a lot of stories recently, and to also you know, remember that men. There's many statistics that show that men are victims of childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse, and 50% of women in substance abuse treatment have a history of rape or incest. So understanding definitely that the trauma overall, the people that are in our systems have a history of trauma. One of the most important studies, I think, of really understanding the association between childhood trauma and then later on life, their health and their well-being, is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And this was a study that was developed through the CDC and Center for Disease Control, but also Kaiser Permanente, which is a HMO, a health maintenance organization. So more than 17,000 people participated in this study, and it still is going on to this day. And it really looked at their childhood experiences. And there was an exam and really a review and questions of their experiences early in life. And we're going to go into the details of that, but it really showed that many of these risk factors and adverse childhood experiences were the causes directly linked to illnesses and early death, as well as poor quality of life. So this is definitely a very important study for us, anybody who's working in public health. I also want to note that there are a couple other studies that show, national studies that show the mortality and morbidity rate for people who are in the public mental health system are dying 30 years younger than other people in public health services. The ACE study really looked at 10 categories, and these are questions that they asked people. And the categories were really the abuse of the child, and then trauma in the household or environment, so exposure to trauma, and then neglect of the child. So this includes psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and then substance use in the home, parental separation or divorce, any kind of emotional issue that someone had in the household, especially to the level of suicidal or suicide attempts, violence to the mother, and then prison, a member of the family that was imprisoned. They also looked at abandonment and if the child's basic needs were met. So I'm just going to next slide. So the recurrent and severe abuse was also looked at. And I think it's important for us to say that and encourage people to go on their website and to get more information about this, because the more they call it the ACE score, so the more of these indicators that you've had experience and exposure to, the more likely you were to have alcohol, drug use, have emotional issues, and also physical health. So it is very clear from this study that adverse childhood events and experiences have major health consequences. And it's really because of these healthy risk behaviors that people had adopted. And these are coping mechanisms. These are survival skills that people have really adapted to get through life. And they include a variety of things of eating disorders, smoking, definitely substance abuse and self-harm, and really, having behaviors that are going to put themselves at risk. And then that was seen to lead to severe medical conditions, a variety of diseases and cancers, and ultimately early death. And the ACE study really looked a lot about addiction and uncovered a lot of understanding addiction. And the more higher the ACE score that you had, it was, there's actually a great documentary that I have at the end in the resources called Healing Mean. And there's a website link to that as well, that really shows the fact that You know, the higher the score, the more likely that you are to be an intravenous drug user. And it was incredible, the links to substance use. And that documentary definitely it shows a woman's life where she had a score of 10 and how she overcame and is actually a national spokesperson for the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. So anyway, addiction is best viewed as an understandable, unconscious, compulsive use of psychoactive materials in response to abnormal prior life experiences, most of which are concealed by shame, secrecy, and social taboo. And one of the other resources that I have at the end of this PowerPoint and a great training was Dr. Gabor Mate. And he's written several books, one about addiction, a lot about mental health conditions, but also the link to trauma and your health. And he really talks about addiction is not only of using substances, but a variety of different things, including gambling and sex addiction and shopping. He shares his own personal, experience with trauma and addiction to shopping, and really talks about what the brain chemistry does, and you're getting the same rush of dopamine into your brain. So we don't always really see that there's many people who are, numbing their pain and distracting themselves with sitting with their uncomfortable feelings, but not necessarily using, an illegal substance. So I think that was, but it's also about shame, secrecy, and it's social taboo. Okay, so what does the prevalence data tell us? I think we need to understand that all people in mental health services, in child serving systems, substance use, as well as juvenile justice and criminal justice systems, have some history of trauma, be it extreme childhood trauma, but also trauma in adulthood. You cannot be part of these systems for any period of time without witnessing or experiencing trauma. So I think that that's important. And that, it's across all systems of care. And we also need to understand that the relationship with being a victim and then continuing that cycle through life. I know for myself, many years of being victimized in the system, from childhood sexual abuse to institutional abuse, and then even when I became empowered and have been an advocate for many years, dealing with domestic violence. So many of us in the system, it takes many years to recognize the learned behavior and what we are used to and how we see ourselves and the cycle of being a victim. And that also, there's many people that that witness and have had violence and traumatic experiences to them and also offend later in life. Okay, next slide. So this is just a slide, a graph to really show you the adverse childhood experiences through the lifespan. So seeing at the bottom the adverse childhood experiences that happen, and then the impact of that on a social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And then there's an adoption of these health risk behaviors, and then there's the disease, disability, and then social problems, and then eventually early death. So understanding how trauma impacts us, and that we need to understand that we have conditioned responses and tendencies. There's 6 realms in which people are affected by traumatic experiences. Our feelings, our judgments, our beliefs, our frame of reference, our memory, perception, and body and brain. And I think definitely feelings of affecting our self-esteem, our judgment, our beliefs, our overall worldview of people and things. And then we're going to talk more about the body and brain as well. So emotional numbing. You'll see very often that there's no connection to our own feelings and emotions. And once again, this is definitely a survival skill that has been adopted. But if we are not connected to ourselves and to our own emotions, we are definitely going to be detached from others and definitely lack of motivation. The emotional numbing also can be used, substance use and many other things to disconnect from our feelings and our emotions. Obviously, avoiding any place or person or activity that is associated with any traumatic experience. And then sensory reminders. Sensory reminders are often referred to as triggers. I personally don't like the word trigger. It's a triggering word for me. Some of us that have been doing some of the trauma training have adopted a sensory reminder. And this is really very important for us to understand when we're trying to see how trauma affects people. People may not even be aware of their own sensory reminders. But these are things that people can hear, taste, smell, that can remind us of that traumatic event. So for instance, there's many times where I'll be walking down the street and I'll just have a smell of something that can bring me back, not so much in the common phrase of flashbacks, where I'm brought back to a visual time of witnessing or reliving the experience, but often flashbacks are of what you were feeling in that moment. So it's bringing back the feelings of, guilt and shame. For me, just feeling nauseous and being in that, constant state of frightened and being alert. Yeah.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So recently in the news and periodically in the news, things will come up like Sandusky, and we see where children have been sexually molested or abused. Is that another example of how triggers or this can remind people, and then they can start to have problems again?
Yeah, absolutely. I know many youth that I worked with, watching a movie or anything on the news. At one point for myself, the pedophile that had offended me when I was younger was on the news for something, another crime that he had committed. And just seeing his face, obviously, brought things back. So absolutely, it could be visual, but sometimes it can be, a picture or something that somebody says. A person, there's been youth that I've worked with in the hospital where a staff member sounded like the abuser in his life. And just the voice would send that person into, the same feelings that they felt in reliving that trauma, be it rage or, shame, guilt, whatever it is. So I think it's very important when we're trying to incorporate a trauma-informed environment, and we'll go more into detail of that people need to identify for themselves what their sensory reminders are, but providers need to be aware of and really get to know and build that relationship with that person to know what their possible sensory reminders, and also identify when they're going through that, when something has brought that on for them. There's also Dr. Gabor Mate said something in his, did a 3-day training with him, and it really stuck with me. He said, If it's hysterical, it's historical. So if you are reacting to a situation where you should not be that upset about a situation, or you're overreacting, or you are, being rageful or really upset, then you need to look at what has just happened, because that is something, some sensory reminder of your history that has just, been triggered, so to speak. So, so that's something that I always think of. So also understanding the body and the brain connection. We may not always remember things, but our bodies do. And as trauma survivors, we understand that, it's years of being in a constant state of alert. And I think it's really important for us to understand people that live in institutions for any period of time are in this constant state of fear and lack of control of their environment. And it really is your body being in this flight, freeze, fight mode. And that really constantly, that stress, your body being under that stress for an extended amount of time is going to cause physical illness. There's a lot of research that shows stress connections to cancer and other illnesses. So really understanding also there's a lot of things and some of the resources about breathing, and the fact that a lot of trauma survivors don't even realize that they're holding their breath a lot of the times. And that also, our pain switch sometimes is like stuck on. A lot of people are diagnosed with fibromyalgia and constant, overall pain in our body. And this is not something that is a figment of our imagination. This is definitely been researched and validated. So let's see, go to the next slide. So it's important for us to really understand how trauma is shaping us and really our beliefs and how we interact with the world. And so our worldview is how, it's all our experiences, what that makes up of how we see the world. So it's all of our beliefs. And often people who have experienced trauma in their life have an overall view of powerlessness. And we're always expecting the negative. For many years, I just gave up thinking anything would ever happen positively because I would just be disappointed because it was constant negative things happening to me. And then eventually we become really hopeless and negative. And then also a sense of helplessness and untrusting of everybody, and also just a disbelief that people can be good. I think we need to understand how trauma affects how we relate to ourselves, and obviously it's going to affect our self-esteem. For many people who are trauma survivors, especially sexual abuse, even to the point where you're not comfortable in your own skin and your own self-worth is so low that depression and suicide attempts, but also cutting and is a way of trying to feel something. So these are all really understanding how trauma affects yourself. I think one piece of it that we don't talk about a lot in any kind of mental health services or in trauma trainings is how it affects our sexuality for men and women. And a lot of times in the mental health system, we don't even talk about people as being sexual beings. People still have a belief that we shouldn't be parents. So sometimes I feel that they think that people in the mental health system are asexual. But we are sexual beings, and we need to understand that if we do want to heal from trauma, especially sexual trauma or violence, that we need to pay attention to how it has affected our core being, our self-worth, and how if we want to have a healthy lifestyle and full wellness, that includes our sexuality. It includes being intimate with people. And really having more, we need to really expand the support around that area. Trauma also really affects how we relate to others. Because if we're not comfortable in being in our own skin, we're not going to be comfortable with relating with others and building relationships. The fact that we have such a hard time trusting people, especially when we've been violated by people repeatedly, and had, compounding traumatic events in our life, it's really hard for us to interact with people and to build those connections. Trauma really shapes the way that we perceive people also in events and situations. And I know for myself and many trauma survivors, especially women who've had sexual violence, relating to men is definitely something that people really need to work on. And we may perceive that all men are going to be violent, take advantage of us, and that, no man is going to be a good person. And really looking at how that trauma has really affected that, our relationships with men. So we need to understand that traumatic experiences shape us, and a lot of times it's understandable, it's totally normal and understandable, but we have to really promote healing, and understand that healing is possible for everybody. And it's really about transforming these negative beliefs that we have, all of these coping mechanisms that we've developed, and really look at how we can change our beliefs about ourselves, our world, and find some kind of spirituality or connection to our community and to a bigger source. So healing, it doesn't have to be painful, but it definitely can be, especially in the beginning. We need to understand that it is a lifelong journey. It's different for everybody. And we're going to talk about the different techniques and more holistic approaches. But ultimately, it's about finding out what works for you as an individual. I know for myself, a lot of self-help and peer support has been essential in the healing process for myself. But it's all about regaining our personal power. And to really help people in that journey of healing, we need to help people really ask themselves, what sense did they make of what happened to them? Really looking at how did your trauma affect you? How does that really, how do you see yourself, and how do others see you? And then most importantly, what patterns have developed as a result. And I think this is something that a lot of peer support is really helping each other and learning from people in different parts of their journey. What sense do I have? I know for myself, I went through horrible things for many years, but it's giving me the strength and the knowledge to be who I am today, and that I'm able, to do the work that I do today. But it's really about seeing ourselves as not broken and not ill and not damaged. But it's about healing, and that it's not our fault for what happened, and trying to make sense of that. So understanding trauma-informed practices in services especially, we need to understand that it really needs to be a culture change and it needs to be every part of the organization, from top down. There needs to be an overall basic understanding of how trauma affects people and how it affects every aspect of their life. I think it's very important, if you're going to be trauma informed, we have to really look at everything that you do in your own agency or program that could be harmful to people and could be re-traumatizing people. You know, especially, and we're going to get into some of the details of that, restraint and seclusion is one of the most re-traumatizing practices that happens in you know, not just the mental health system, but in a lot of our systems. And I know for trauma survivors, just witnessing that is traumatic. But, you know, I know for myself, being 12 years old, being restrained, and in mechanical restraint by multiple men, taking your clothes off and injecting you with chemical restraint, you know, those were the type of things that happened to me that was worse than any of the sexual abuse.
Could you just clarify for some folks who may not be aware, can you just clarify where restraint seclusion occurs and how that happens?
Sure. So primarily in psychiatric hospitals. There are children's systems at different levels of care, even in schools, where there are restraints where people are held down by staff. And then also seclusion in the children's system is usually in a quiet room that's not locked. But in the adult system, there still are seclusion rooms that are locked, where there's no stimulation whatsoever. But there's many, I mean, we have state hospitals, community hospitals, county hospitals that are still not only restraining people with physical force, but using mechanical restraints. You know, for myself as an adolescent, 12 years old, being restrained by a mechanical restraint, which is a sheet that straps a person down to a metal bed frame with like 50 buckles, where you can only move your head. You can be put into these restraints for up to 2 hours. In 1999, there were federal regulations because so many people were dying in restraints that limited the time to 4 hours. New York State extended that even further to 2 hours limitations. But often there's really a overuse of chemical restraints, and that is being forcibly, you know, put down and restrained, held down, and then having an injection of a chemical that pretty much paralyzes you to the point where you cannot move and talk. And that happens not only in psychiatric facilities, but also in the community. There's many people that are very over medicated, and it's definitely used as control and a chemical restraint. So these are the type of practices that are definitely damaging and re-traumatizing. So let's see. So just looking at what is not trauma-informed and what trauma-informed looks like. And these are just some examples. And being trauma-informed is really a recognition of that everybody has some exposure to trauma and experience to trauma. I know for myself and many people, being in the mental health system for many years, and never once was it acknowledged. You know, it's known that you were sexually abused or had a history of trauma, but it was never even talked about. So having it not be something that is taboo or not talked about, but that it's recognized that this is something that everyone has dealt with, and really normalizing that. And also really changing the whole system of and culture of that program to understand all the components of trauma and how it affects people, and also making sure that people have other supports, connections to the community, to peer support. I think is really important. In trauma work, you know, there's many different models. And it's making sure that providers feel comfortable with talking with people and having a conversation about their trauma. But it's important for us to remember that, you know, you sit in the therapist's office for 45 minutes and you're talking about, you know, really horrible things and reliving things, and then you go home and you're sitting with that. So I think to be trauma informed, we really, as providers, we have a responsibility to make sure that people are connected to other supports in their community. And then also avoid some of the practices that are very common in institutions and residential programs and also community programs. Level systems are very punitive. The more choice that and control that you give people, the better in a program. And also having that shared power.
Just to clarify what level systems are, that you know, it's like a point system where you get points for good behavior. The enhanced level systems that are being used currently don't punish people for, or get demerits, if you will, for the bad behavior or the unwanted behavior. So that's kind of what a level system is, and as Eva said, it's not helpful. All it seems to do is remind there's a power differential, and you know, one person has the power to do things and one person doesn't. So.
And when you're living in a facility where staff have total control over your life, and you know, taking points away is taking freedoms away within that already restricted environment. And I think it's really important for us to really see the power over and really using it in a very punitive way, and you know, being very hurtful and almost promoting an environment that is going to be hostile, and that's when restraints, usually the numbers go up for restraints and seclusion and stuff like that. So I've been part of the PARS training, Positive Alternatives to Restraint and Seclusion, which is an OMH initiative working in the children's, a couple of the facilities. And there's also been another initiative in the adult, one of the state forensic hospitals that have dramatically reduced restraint and seclusion. And that's really doing these trauma trainings, making sure that there's a culture change where the staff understand the dynamics of that power over, you know, understanding that people are going to be triggered and have those sensory reminders all the time if you're taking away their power, if you are disrespecting them, and having that power struggle all the time. So language is very important, and I think that we really, in any trauma-informed environment, have to have person-first language, and that we need to be strength-based. And really take also, I will add to that, take away the illness-based language. And that's, and you know, I'm going to get into that. The whole title of this is changing the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And really seeing people for people, and not seeing them as ill. And that has to be used in your language, and really looking at all the language that you use and making sure that it's strength-based. So once again, the environment, making sure, you know, there's many things that you can do in your environment, in a clinic situation, residential situation, where you can really reevaluate all of the things that you have, all the barriers. You know, if you have separate bathrooms for staff and residents, I mean, that in itself sends a very big message. If you have certain areas where, you know, a nursing station or staff area where clients or people who are using services can't go, I mean, these are putting barriers, and it's definitely not a shared power environment. So trauma-informed is really about building safe and trusting relationships. That's the basis of it. And how do we do that? I think if we incorporate the recovery model and all these components of the recovery model, which this really came from SAMHSA, and it's a national consensus on components of mental health recovery. We understand we have to have respect for people. We have to give them hope. That means when people, are coming in pain and are suffering emotionally, that we're not seeing them as ill or damaged, that we're giving them hope that things will get better, that recovery is possible. We need to be strength-based. That means that we need to see the best in people and point that out and remind them of all of their gifts and talents and have them really remember all their dreams that they've had. Peer support is essential in recovery. We need to be able to connect to people who've gone through similar experiences, and sharing that knowledge and understanding of their own paths of recovery is very valuable to each other. And through that, empowerment definitely happens. Responsibility is important. We need to help people take responsibility for their life. And through the mental health system, especially years of being institutionalized, people become learned helplessness and so dependent on services. So when people become empowered, it's about taking responsibility for your life. And, today I will not allow a person to be abusive in my life. It's getting to that point where you are in control of your life. And you also have self-direction where, you are in control of where you're going. It has to be holistic. And it's not just mind, body, and spirit, but it's also your whole life. It's your community. It's what do you want for your life? Be it volunteering, working, going to school. It's your whole person, not just whatever a person is coming into, and your family, children. So nonlinear, I think, is really important because people think someone's doing well and they're recovered and they're in recovery, and we need to understand that that I really see it as peaks and valleys. And many people, there's going to be things in your life that losses and other things that happen that are going to have you, get into a valley, and understand that, making sure you have support and understanding that you will be back up on a peak again, and that it's not just a straight line. And services needs to be individualized and person-centered. This is where the power is given to the person. We need to have shared power. That person needs to be in the driver's seat. And often in the mental health system, many people, I can speak for myself, I didn't even feel like I was in the passenger seat or the back seat. I felt like I was on the corner watching the car being driven by somebody else. So we need to make sure that any treatment plan, any plan that is developed, that person is the one that's really driving that plan. And we need to be culturally sensitive. We have to make sure that we are seeing people for their own unique culture, talents that they bring to the table, and really having an interest in that and seeing that part of the person. So some of the values and competencies of people that should be providing, or who are providing services, we need to really be committed to recovery and inspiring hope. We need to have accountability, remember the power of language. First and foremost, we need to be direct, honest, and respectful in our communication. And it needs to be, mutual responsibility. Like I said, that shared power of building that relationship. We also need to be moving towards, a future that the person wants, instead of always focusing on the next crisis and going backwards. And this really comes from intentional peer support, which is Sherry Mead, and it's a phenomenal training, and really is trauma informed, and really gives a framework for people to really understand peer support. So the paradigm shift has to be not power over, but shared power. And the focus needs to be on what the individual wants and needs, and that they have the control. Many times it's the opposite, where people have power over you. And in all levels of services, there's expectations, there's people who have decision-making over many aspects of your life. But we need to get to a point where it's shared power, where it's about the connection and the relationship that's the most important. And you can find common ground and have that mutual responsibility. And that's really where it inspires hope and possibilities. So once again, from Sherry Mead's Intentional Peer Support, understanding fear versus hope, and where the fear-based language and the fear-based responses come from. Because fear-based relationships is all focused on what's wrong. And it's really always being afraid of what's going to happen, and where a person, what's going to happen when they leave that office. But hope-based relationships is always based on what's possible, and you're able to co-create something new together. In fear-based responses, and many times in the medical model and in the mental health system and other systems, it's all about stabilizing the situation, stabilizing the person. You're taking care of people, and it's always predictable. The person's doing well, but you're always waiting for the next crisis. And it's about, people in the system have gotten used to that cycle. And it's about, going to day treatment, mental health housing, smoking cigarettes, and looking forward to the next meal. And that's really, and the next crisis. And that's your life. But when you switch things around to be more hope-based, you are looking forward to possibilities, and possibilities are opened up. It's also about, when you're coming from a hope-based response, it's about learning to sit with discomfort. And I think that that's one of the major things that people really need to understand to be trauma-informed. And that goes for people who have trauma experiences, but also provide services, is that we need to learn that it's okay to hear something that's going to be uncomfortable, and learn to sit with that, and to be there for the person and just let them talk. And also making sure that we stay in connection with people, and being aware of when we're not in connection with people, when that starts to break down. But that's when you're coming from a hope-based response. So fear-based language is about compliance. It's about for your own good. Everything's about when a person is decompensating. And then, are you safe? And I want to say, are you safe? When someone asks me that, or somebody else, fear is all we have, because we're afraid of getting locked up. Because that's usually the next thing that happens. The hope-based language is really about collaborating. It's about positive risk-taking. And what does that mean? Positive risk-taking is about when someone wants to go to work, that you support them in that. It's not, saying you're not ready for that, and being afraid and fearful for the person. It's helping a person if they want to lower medication or try new things, new connections to the community. Those are all positive risk-taking. Excuse me. And then also really having the language of recovery. So, yeah. So having the question change from what's wrong with you to what happened to you really shifts the relationship. And it's amazing from the first interaction that you have with someone, service provider, that's trauma informed. You can feel just from that question alone what happened to you. There's no judgment. They're seeing you as a person. They're not seeing you as a disease or broken or damaged. And it opens up the possibilities for the healing to begin and really begin that journey. And then also looking at strengths to overcome all of that. So we need to focus on the relationship versus the individual when you're trauma informed. When it's just about the individual person's coming for help, you're the expert, they're the one with the problem, and no one else has to change but them. We lose sight of our own learning and also the relational dynamic, and we also have predetermined outcomes. But when it's focused on the relationship, it's mutual learning. And you're able to communicate honestly and open. And also that really becomes a model for other relationships in people's lives. And I know for myself, just, working in a strength-based way for many years and becoming trauma-informed and recovery-focused has really changed my life, not just the people that I work with, but it really changed your perspective and relationships throughout your life. Just to understand more about the fear-based response, we want to make sure that we understand that these are harmful, that these risks assessments and contracting for your safety, for your own good, but it's coming from the person's uncomfortable, so I need to control the situation. And ultimately, people get taken out of the community. But when we are coming from a hope-based response, we're working out both of our needs. It's about shared power and the willingness to stretch, to expand, to be flexible, to think outside of the box. There's so many more possibilities when it's coming from a hope-based response. And we look together for new meaning in things. And it's also proactive planning. So looking at some of the real components that we just talked about of being trauma-informed and coming from hope-based responses, there are specific models. Definitely, like I said, the Sherry Mead intentional peer support is terrific for peer support. But there's also models like the sanctuary model for residential facilities. And this is one that really promotes a healing environment. It's about shared power, and it's not coercive practices or fear-based. And definitely it reduces restraints and, any violent incidents. And there's a link there for people to get more information. Also, another model, Essence of Being Real. And this is a peer-to-peer model for any, not just peer-to-peer of mental health services. Oh, I'm sorry. Next page. Sorry about that. So this is about having supports for any group of people that have dealt with a traumatic experience. So that could be disaster. That could be, any group of abuse, people who have been abused, crime, but also frontline service providers and agency staff. When we talk about the secondary trauma and vicarious trauma, we need to remember how much that is impacting us. And we cannot continue to be trauma-informed if we don't have support for ourselves and make sure that we are, having outlets for our own wellness and maintaining that. So this is definitely a good model for that. Risking Connection model is a curriculum And this really promotes empowerment, connection, and collaboration. It's used more in a clinical setting, but it's also really great for responding to crises, self-injury, suicidal depression, disassociation, and self-awareness, and also transforming vicarious traumatization. So, holistic alternatives. This is really, really looking at beyond our services in our lives, for trauma-informed services in the community, be it hospitals, community supports, really looking at making sure that people are aware of other paths of wellness, that there's a variety of other things that we need to make sure that people have access to, and also, a connection to. So these are some of the examples of some holistic alternatives. I know for myself, many of these things have helped me in my journey of recovery. I'm a person that they said as a child that I would never work, that I'd be institutionalized for the rest of my life, or in and out of institutions, wouldn't be able to go to school, and that definitely I was ill and that I'd be on medication for the rest of my life. And I've been working since I came home at 17 years old, and I've gone to school and been an advocate for 20 years, but I've also been off of psychiatric medication for the last 10 years. And everyone's different, but there are definitely people that can incorporate natural things, and definitely different ways of implementing their recovery. And so for myself, meditation and yoga has been huge influence for myself. I will say that definitely the therapeutic drumming, dance, some of the acupuncture, some of these are ancient forms of healing. And really understanding that there is a meditative, through music and drumming, that it really regulates your brainwaves. It calms you down. It's a natural de-stressor. And these are, definitely ancient things and, forms of healing that, that there's a lot of research for many years that validates it. And just understanding that meditation, it's anything that you're doing where you have your full focus and attention. It's not just sitting and quieting your mind, but you can also be focusing on something and quiet your mind, and have a real grounding that happens. And so these are some examples that people have, and we've been adding to this list in the trainings that we've been doing. But I know for many people, gardening and animals, that's really a very meditative. Animals has been a huge part of my life for healing, and many other survivors in the community. And there's a lot of research with people and children that have been traumatized, and the healing effects of animals. So these are a couple pages of additional resources, and just a few things that I really wanted to point out. I commented on Dr. Gabor Mate, that's his website, and the book about addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts. I think it's very valuable. Here are some of the other books that we recommend. I also would like to say something about You Can Heal Your Life, which is Louise L. Hay, and that's really positive affirmations. And I think that this is something that is really important in a lot of the healing process. When we're trying to change the negative beliefs that have been these conditioned, responses to trauma, and these ingrained beliefs, we have these messages that are going on in our heads of years of hearing that you're worthless, and whatever the messages are in your head as a trauma survivor. We need to make sure that we throw that tape away, record a new one. And positive affirmations is definitely a tool that has helped hundreds of people over the years that I've worked with, of really combating any negative, beliefs that are coming back to you on a regular basis. Killing Mean is also the documentary that I recommended and mentioned in the beginning. I really recommend that. It's free. It's something that we show at all of our symposiums, and it's a phenomenal documentary. Also, breath, body and mind seminars, really understanding. There are psychiatrists. They've done a lot of research on breathing and trauma-informed therapy, and the outcomes have been incredible. The breathing work, how that really made such more of an impact than just having talk therapy that's trauma-informed. And they worked with the tsunami survivors and the 9/11 survivors. There's a lot of great research there. Understanding that there's some other techniques that have been helpful for people. Emotional freedom technique. There's also EMDR, which is eye movement reprocessing. Thank you. Biofeedback, and the National Trauma Child Stress Network has a lot of material. Sherry Mead, that I mentioned before. And here's a whole nother list of valuable resources that I think people can definitely find more information. So I think we're definitely can open this up for maybe some questions, Tony.
Absolutely. But first, wow, that was a lot of information and a lot of good stuff. And I'm really glad that you left some room at the end for people to take a look at this, because, frankly, as you were going through the slides, I was like, wow, we could do like another 15 minutes on this topic, on this part of it, and another 10 minutes on this part of it. So it's, I hope people will take advantage of all the wonderful resources that you've put out there. There's one thing that if you don't mind my just pointing out there, was, in the work that I've done with people in forensics and in the prisons, and just assuming that everyone has trauma with if they're in our mental health system, I think it's important to remember, if you're a provider out there, is that for people who've had these experiences, they are tough. They are resilient people. I mean, we have learned how to adapt and survive in extraordinarily difficult situations. That needs to be recognized. And when you bring that out and you tell somebody, like, you must be a really strong person. I mean, you're still here. You get up every day. You're still going. Their faces are like one of surprise. Like they've never even recognized any positive things about themselves. So I think it's really important because it's true, and people forget about it.
And I will say definitely that is the piece of being strength-based. It's seeing the struggles that you've gone through is immense strength that you've had to overcome, and the fact that you're still here. I also think, that there's even some of the risky behaviors or some of the things that providers are very fearful of, like cutting, for instance, that, definitely in peer support and Sherry Mead's model and others, that really trying to understand where that's coming from, and seeing that person is obviously in immense pain, and that it's not manipulation and some of the beliefs around that, but that it's a skill that they have adapted to survive. And to not see it as a problem to be fixed necessarily, but to be more educated from more of a harm reduction type of model, but incorporating all of the other pieces of holistic approaches and other supports, where people naturally stop some of these more riskier type of behaviors. So once they become empowered, once they see things as a strength and understand the meaning of why they're doing it, and seeing that connection, the slide that I showed about what is the meaning that you've taken from your experiences. How do you see yourself? How do you think other people see you? And then what have been the behaviors that have developed? And seeing them definitely as strengths, but what do you want for your life? And is that something that is going to, making the connection, is that something that has benefited me? And what do I want to really incorporate that might be more healthy? But making sure that that person comes to that decision themselves and to support them through that process. But yes, definitely being strength-based, I think seeing all people, never, seeing a person that they're not capable of recovery, but also that everyone has strengths.
Absolutely. So there's probably several questions that have come in while we've chatted here. But there were two that came in while we were talking that I think are going to be very relevant to a majority of people. So one of the questions that came in was, so if a person is a danger to themselves or others, how can we address that? How can we be helpful? What interventions or suggestions do you have that will, minimize the re-traumatization?
I think that there are a lot of services that are not as harmful. So yes, you definitely want to make sure that the person is in a safe place. But there are some models of, just having a person be in their presence, and really using a peer support model where there's crisis alternatives instead of locking a person up. So really, being with the person and listening to what they're going through, and making that human connection. Definitely the assist training, as well as some of the other peer support models, emotional CPR as well. Like, there's a lot of models out there that incorporate peers, where it's a person that understands what you're going through, that can connect with you in the moment of a crisis, that sometimes you can totally avert hospitalization altogether. But there are some programs in the state, nationally and internationally, that are peer-run respite type of crisis alternative housing, where people can go and feel safe, and not have to be stripped of their freedom and their rights by being locked up and be in a very hostile environment. So it's really coming from a place of understanding what they're going through, instead of seeing it as a problem to be fixed. Yeah, so there's a lot of different techniques that can be used, and I think peers are definitely one of them. And to approach people in a not coming from a fear-based response, but from a hope-based response.
I think it's important too is that just to change the category of that question is that I think that sometimes providers can overreact to the danger, and that they're not, people, my peers, when we talk, we say things to each other that I would never say to a provider, because I know that they would misunderstand what I'm saying and they would interpret it in the wrong way. So danger, just figuring out whether a person is dangerous or whether there is a danger can be tricky in and of itself. And I tend to think that people can overreact. And I'm trying to understand where they're coming from as well. I mean, for programs that have had maybe some completed suicides, or they've been sued, or there's been something tragic that has happened there, they obviously don't want to have that happen again. Unfortunately, it's an unrealistic expectation.
Well,
things happen.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of providers are definitely, liability is the underlining, it's the fear-based response of, what's going to happen when they leave my office, and wanting to control that. And the reality is that you really don't have control over that. What you can do is support people, and I think that prevention is really, being proactive and making sure that people definitely are working in a trauma-informed way, but that they're connected to other supports. And I think having more community supports, definitely running peer support for many years, if someone had someone to call at 2 in the morning, that is definitely something that can reduce hospitalization. Having that support, having other people in your life, that it's not just the clinician, I think is really important. But when we're talking about being trauma-informed, it's about looking at what you're moving towards, the things that you want in your life. So when you start changing your perception on things, yes, there's going to be, those peaks and valleys, but if you build a support network for yourself and have people in your life that you can talk to and that you have, other different connections and supports and you're not as isolated, I've seen hundreds of people who used to be hospitalized on a regular basis that haven't had a hospitalization in years. And that's because they have the supports that they don't need to. They've gotten out of the cycle of crisis, and also it's learned language. It's learned that I don't feel safe, so I need to be in the hospital. And so it's having conversations with people of really, what does the hospital do for you? What does safety really mean to you? But I think providers need to be open to really changing the way that they work with people to be more trauma informed and to be open to helping people make those connections.
We have a lot of questions. We're not going to get to them all, and I apologize. We are going to do another webinar on trauma next month. That's going to be a little more focused on adolescents and children. So for the folks who have questions around that, we'll make sure that you get the link to that. That's going to be on September 5th from 1 to 2:30. But just a couple more questions here. So how do we incorporate these holistic approaches more into the system, and how can providers really focus on that more?
Well, I think definitely there's programs that can bring in some of these things. I know that there's definitely some peer programs that have incorporated meditation and acupuncture and Reiki, and a lot of it has been pro bono, so it's making those connections. But at the Mental Health Empowerment Project, we are very much into asset-based community development. So it's really about connecting people to the community instead of making a group of mental health, people who use mental health services having their own little isolated group, or even going to, creating a group in the community where it's once again just people with psychiatric labels or diagnoses that are involved in it. So it's really, it's getting to know the people that you're working with and finding out what their interests are, what their strengths, what their skills, what their dreams are, and really connecting them to people that can maybe help them get connected to the community if you don't have the time as a provider. But making sure that people are integrated into the community, bringing some of this into your programs, but that person is not going to be at your program forever, and it's still very isolating when we segregate people into our own little groups. So I'm a firm believer of looking at the resources that people have and the strengths and skills, and then connecting them to the resources and all the information and wealth of things that are in their community.
Okay, another question. So you spoke about being physically restrained in an institution setting, mm-hmm. And its negative effects. Mm-hmm. So what about therapeutic holds for a child in school, or a child having a tantrum, where they might hurt themselves or they might hurt other people.
Yes. Definitely this has been a debate. When we talk about fighting to eliminate restraint and seclusions in all settings, in all mental health settings, including children's, there's that small percentage of people that are like, we cannot eliminate it 100% because we need to be able to protect the other children or other people in if someone is out of control. But the real way to avoid this is to incorporate a trauma-informed environment. And there have been places that have, almost eliminated that.
Mm-hmm.
And really making sure that people do not get set off. There's a process that happens before a person gets out of control. So it's developing those relationships, getting to know that person, that child, before there's a sensory reminder or something that is going to, make that person rageful or get out of control. So I think it's a systems-wide issue that needs to really, we need to reform our services and our system. Personally, because I have been violated so many times by restraints and in the system, I am not supportive of any time that you have to put your hands on a child or an adult. But I do know that there are some places that do really great work, but there are certain times where, they feel that they have to do that.
I like the idea when they talk about when they have to use a restraint or a seclusion that we make sure we remember that's a treatment failure.
Yes,
that's a
absolutely.
failure of treatment. That is not something.
And I will say too that at SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, wrote a training curriculum. It's a roadmap to eliminate restraint and seclusion in all mental health settings. And I think that was back in like 2004, 2005. Phenomenal curriculum. And if that is implemented, truly, if there is a culture change where you will, you don't need to have violence. When people feel safe and respected, you don't have incidents like this.
Yeah, and just a quick plug is recently they did some more stuff with the PARs, the positive alternatives. There's 6 webinars based on the 6 core strategies from SAMHSA.
Right.
Those are up on the OMH website under webcast. They're really wonderful. That was such a great process that we went through fairly recently within the last couple of years. So
that's great. I just wanted to say one last thing that, at the Mental Health Empowerment Project through our SAMHSA grant, we will be working with Kathy Cave and Darby Penny to really do statewide regional trainings and to really build more coalitions, working with existing trauma task force, working with OMH, looking at all the initiatives and really trying to build on that. We need more providers that are trauma informed, doing individual clinical treatment, but also making sure that our residential, our institutions, all of our mental health services are trauma informed. So, I encourage people to get in touch with me. I know there's more questions. Please feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Well, geez, I could sit here and talk. I have so much more I want to talk about, but unfortunately we do have to call time, and I do apologize that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. I thank everyone for coming. This has been one of the best attended. We ended up with about 325 people total. That's more than any other webinar that we've ever had before. I hope people enjoyed it. This was, and got a lot out of it. This was one of those few webinars where people were giving us a lot of feedback in the middle of it, saying how great it was, and a couple of people had to leave early, and they just wanted to let us know how much they've enjoyed it. So I just want to remind people we will be sending a copy of the PowerPoint out again later this week, either tomorrow or Friday. early or middle next week, we'll send out the link. We'll put this up on YouTube, so you'll be able to share it with anyone in your agency, or if anyone had to leave early, they'll also have access to it as well. So I want to thank you, Eva. That was just phenomenal, and it really just touched on so many important things. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Eva. And we will see you hopefully next month on September 5th. Bye now.